So there we go. Okay.
I was hoping they'd record it.
So continue.
Hmm?
Push continue. You want to say?
No, I'll sit next to you when it's time.
Rami, are you Rami S. Mangubi, or that is someone else?
That is me.
Oh my goodness.
That is
So-
I am Rami Mangubi, yeah.
All right, so I saw the work you do. That is fascinating engineering work. Wow.
Thank you.
Okay. We're going to wait a couple of minutes until everybody, until our time rolls around, everyone, but thank you for joining us early. Janet, do you think we're going to come back to this topic again for future programs?
Yes, we would like to, the committee would like to for next year.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Janet, we now have somebody who joins us on a regular basis from Australia. So
Yes.
so we can invite Viv to be one of our speakers one day.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I think she'd be delighted to. And Enid, if I could ask you to unmute yourself, just share with everybody the dramatic photograph that's over your shoulder.
These are remnants of Torahs from Simferopol in Ukraine that were brought back years ago, were given to a couple going back to Portland, Oregon for burial in the Jewish cemetery there. And before they were buried, they took a series of photos of the Torahs. And when I was in Portland, Oregon, I took a picture of a picture.
Nice.
That's wonderful.
We can always count on Enid for incredible backgrounds with all of her travels around the world. And it's wonderful listening to her explanations every Friday night. We're very blessed to have her with us and our guest today.
Rami, I just wanted to ask one more question before we go in. So you do research on failure, on what happens when systems don't work?
Yeah, that's one of my, that's one of the things I worked on, failure detection in different dynamic systems, plants. I also did a lot of research on medical imaging, stem cell image analysis. How do I analyze stem cells without using chemicals, but by analyzing pictures of the cells? I have several patents in that area. Some of them were licensed. I did retina image analysis, and I did work in inertial navigation. The great thing about Draper is that it's almost intoxicated with technical diversity. You could get a lot of breadth and depth there, and it's a not-for-profit R&D center.
Got it. I was asking in part because we're all getting a lesson on systems failure in the war in Ukraine right now, with all of the information about what percentage of things are not, working. The news today that 60% of the missiles are not functional. So clearly your expertise, it's such an important project. So thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'll wait another minute or so. I think we'll give people a little bit more time to join us. And if I could ask everyone to please mute themselves until we do some, Q&A, and then you'll have the opportunity to unmute yourself. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a very special B'nai Tikva adult education program. I want to take this opportunity before we begin to thank the Adult Education Committee, which conceptualized the idea of doing some programs on world Jewry. It is such an interesting fact that the Jewish communities that Lori and I were raised in on Long Island, and to some extent, most of our community, trace our origins back to a few countries, mostly in the area of Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Poland, Belarus. And that's where most of the Jews that we think about in America trace themselves to. But as we know, the Jewish people are a world community. And that sense of the Jews as a community that exists throughout the world was so powerful and compelling, particularly before World War II and the creation of the State of Israel. The losses in Europe in World War II consolidated the Jewish communities there. And of course, the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, and we'll hear more about the 1967 period, was a time also of consolidation in smaller communities and at-risk communities. Today, in the first presentation, and what I hope will be an ongoing series, we have two geographic areas that we are going to be learning about. First, we'll have three presentations about the Jews of Egypt, and then we will have two presentations about Jewish communities in Latin America, in Costa Rica and in Mexico City. So we are delighted to have four speakers with us on this Zoom, and Janet will be reading from a fifth speaker, a member of our congregation, a text that she prepared for today. So again, I want to thank the committee, Janet Silverberg, Lorraine Simon, Nancy Swartz, Stan Zoll, and Robin Zoll, who put together today's program. Thank you so much for making that happen. So everyone, we are going to begin with learning about the Jews of Egypt. And the first speaker that we are going to welcome this morning is Rami Mangubi, who lives in Newton and is part of a Sephardic community there. And Rami's stories of his and his family's experiences are available, and I will be sharing with you both some texts and some recordings later on, in case anyone would like to get a deeper understanding and a deeper dive into Rami and his family's story. So Rami, I'm going to turn things over to you now to say a bit, to tell the story of the Jews of Egypt as refracted through your family memory. And Rami, welcome to B'nai Tikva and to our conversation today.
Thank you, Rabbi Gordon, for this opportunity. I just want to say that even though I'll be talking about my family, what I experienced, an entire Jewish community experienced, that the entire Jewish community of Egypt experienced. And that's just one example of what happened to Jews who are refugees from Arab countries. So yes, it is a personal story, and I feel privileged that I'm giving it, but also I hope to talk about the entire community. It's not just a personal story. So I would like to divide my talk into three parts. One is the background on the Jewish community, the formation of the Jewish community. That's one part, and then their contribution to Egypt. And also that's the second part, what did they do for the country that they lived in? And the third part is the story, which is it's well known, and it's a sad story, their dispersion and the massacres that happened, the incarcerations. And I will be talking about these three parts. So to begin with, the Egyptian Jewish community is both a very old one and a young one. Some Egyptian Jews would trace back their origin to long before the Arab invasion of the 7th century, long before the Arabs came and ruled Egypt. Others came later in the 15th century with the Spanish Inquisition. And then others came after the opening of the Suez Canal in the middle of the 19th century. So, there is also after that, Ashkenazi Jews came and joined at the end of the 19th century. In the beginning of the 20th century, they were escaping pogroms. So this is all that comprised the Jewish community. Until 1848, Jews were considered dhimmi, protected people. They had an inferior status, and other non-Muslims, they had an inferior status. They had to pay a special poll tax, the jizya it's called, that's levied on them. That ended in 1848 when Khedive Said, Egypt's ruler at the time, under European pressure, annulled this poll tax. So as I said, we come from different origins, Sephardim, Ashkenazim, and there was also a Karaite Jewish community in Egypt. And I could say that we are one of the most multilingual Jewish communities in the world, or any community in the world. Many languages, although French and Arabic were the lingua franca. And we are also, for a small community of 80,000, there was a high degree of diversity. Sephardim, that were the great majority, and then there was two small communities, Ashkenazim and Karaites. So that community, when the British were there, when Egypt was becoming a nation after it detached slowly from the Ottoman Empire, flourished in the 20th century, and they contributed way beyond their numbers to the country. So they were responsible for Egypt's modern economy. They played a transformative role. So they established the textile industry, the sugar industry. So until then, sugar and cotton used to be exported to Europe, but there were no industry. The Jews founded that industry, and the stock market in Egypt, the financial sector, they played a major role in it. In fact, the bourses or the stock market would close down in Jewish holidays, something that doesn't happen on Wall Street. Okay, that was thanks to this transformative contribution of Egyptian Jews, Egypt was the most advanced country outside of Europe, America, and Japan. In other words, outside of the Western countries and Japan, Egypt was the #1 country. Remember that the Asian tiger like Taiwan and Thailand and Singapore didn't exist. And that is the economic contribution only of the Jewish community. The other contribution, the cultural contribution, we had composers. The first operetta in the Arabic language was composed by an Egyptian Jew who is a member of my extended family, and he was one of Egypt's foremost composers. There is also, I don't have time to list all the contribution. The biggest publishing house in Egypt was Jewish, and so on. So we contributed, in all modesty, the Jewish community contributed way beyond its size to the country's well-being. Nevertheless, regardless of how many generations Jews lived in Egypt, we were never considered citizens. 90% of Egyptian Jews, regardless of how many generations they lived in Egypt, were not considered Egyptian citizens. Only 10% were. And even for these 10%, like my father, it depends on which government agency you're dealing with. Some would consider you a citizen, some would not. But that was the fact, and that the reasons for that and how this was possible is, we don't have time for that. But as a result, 60% of Egyptian Jews did not have citizenship, they were stateless. 30% were able to get for themselves some piece of paper that says they are Italian, they are French, but it's not, I mean, they never set foot in Italy or in France. They just were able to get a protection from the consulates of these countries. So that 60% were stateless, 30% were quote unquote citizens of other countries, even though they never set foot in these countries. and 10% were supposedly Egyptian, depending on which government agency you're dealing with. That exclusion from citizenship had grave consequences. In 1947, a company law came out that says institutions or big companies, big retail stores must hire only Egyptian. 90% of employees have to be Egyptians, 75% of management. So a lot of Egyptian Jews lost their livelihood, but many were independent lawyers and doctors, or they had their own small jewelry store. These were not affected, but nevertheless, about a third of the community was affected, and they were without a job in 1947. Notice that the citizenship law and this law of employment called the company law has nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's entirely due to Egyptian dynamics, and this dynamics was discrimination against Jews and a few other minorities. I just want to make sure that often they blame Israel and Zionism for that, and it's not right. So this was the situation. Now, with the rise of Nazism, anti-Semitism slowly came to Egypt, slowly grew further in Egypt. And during the 1940s, there were 3 massacres, and about more than 40 people were killed, nearly all of them Jewish. There were 6 non-Jews who, when mobs went into the street, they mistook them for Jews and they killed them. But there were 2 big massacres where only Jews were massacred, and that includes 6 members of my mother's extended family, the Marzouk clan. This was the reality. That was during the war with Israel, but it was just an excuse. The sad thing is that no one went to prison or was taken to. No one was even arrested. Okay. It was absolutely no accountability for these crimes. So that is the situation. And then in 1950s, there was a regime change in Egypt where the monarchy was abolished and a new dictator came. I will not go over these, which dictator came first, but Nasser, his name was Nasser. He was very anti-Jewish, and he was, in a sense, a Nazi sympathizer. So, for instance, by the 60s, you had Nazi war criminals who found refuge in Egypt, and they were hiding they were sought for trial in Europe. And the reason they were hidden is precisely because their activity during World War II was anti-Jewish. So one of them, and it's Johannes von Leers, he was Goebbels' assistant, and he wrote a book called On the Evil Nature of the Jews, or something like that. This person was not only given refuge in Egypt, but he was given citizenship and a private house, and he was also given a government job. And none of the and notice that Egyptian Jews who were there for generations never couldn't get citizenship, and let alone a government job. But that Nazi war criminal was given both, and he is not the only one. There are others. I will not go over different names, but this person was given an Egyptian name, Omar Amin, if you want to look him up. Johannes von Leers is his German name, and he was Goebbels' assistant. So the atmosphere was very hostile, very anti-Semitic, and whenever there is an excuse, Jews would be dispersed, would be thrown out of the country. One of them, some of them, for instance, my aunt and my grandmother, were thrown in 1956 with many Jews. But by the time you get to the 60s, so this was the situation in the 60s. Then came the 1967 war. At that time, I was 12 years old. and a decision was made to arrest all Egyptian Jewish males from the age of 17 to the age of 60 or 65. It was a mass arrest of Egyptian Jews. And at that time, I do remember, I do remember the door knocked at 5 o'clock on June 5, 1967, and two people in civilian clothes asked that my brother come and join them so that he appears at the police station for 10 minutes. That's all they said. My brother got dressed and went. And when that 10 minutes lasted 3 years and 10 days. Okay. And I will tell you what happened to him. But at that time, we had neighbors who came and gave us support and protected us because the hostility wasn't safe to walk in the street. So what happened to my brother and all other Egyptian Jews? Some were deported out of the country right away with their shirt and pants, thrown on a boat and to be thrown or disgorged somewhere in Europe. Others were paraded because Egypt lost the war and there was hardly any Israeli POWs. Israel victory was complete and quick, and Egypt just lost the war. But before that, Egypt was sure to win the war, and the public was expecting a quick victory for the Arabs. And when that didn't happen, and when Egypt did not have Israeli POWs, what did they do? They paraded some of these Egyptian Jews that were arrested in public places, in the Alexandria train station, in the train route from Alexandria to Cairo, and the mobs would come and throw stones on them and would abuse them. And it happened in Cairo, and it happened in Ramses Square in Cairo. They put them on trucks and paraded them before shipping them to the incarceration camps of Abu Za'bal and Tora, Abu Za'bal at that time. And that is a very notorious prison, not far from Cairo. There they were tortured and they were mistreated. They stayed, some stayed 2 years, some stayed 3 years. I do give these details in the interview with the Brazilian website and so on. But I would also like to talk about the families. While the men were incarcerated in Abu Za'bal and later in the Tora prison camp, and they were being tortured, the women had to take over, and most Jews had small stores, jewelry stores, this clothes store, and so on. And at that time, they had to take over, and they were being blackmailed. So customers would come and would buy, but would never pay. And you had to keep your mouth shut. The women had to keep their mouth shut because their loved ones, their husbands, their brother, my uncle was also there, my brother was there, their fathers, their mother, their uncle, their brothers were in prison. So they had to keep their mouth shut. And many went out of business. And if one would say something, they would threaten her and tell her, we will report to the government that you have relatives in Israel. So that was the situation in 1967. Many families were pauperized. The community tried to help, and there was some help from abroad, but these were very, very difficult years. And my family, I was there. My father was not incarcerated, only by luck, because he was, in the first round, he was not arrested. It was my brother. Then when they came and to arrest my father, the custodian told them, pretended that they were coming from, they asked the custodian, where is our flat, our apartment? And the custodian pretended that they were coming for my brother, and he told them, oh no, you took him already. He was already arrested. And he fell through the cracks. So we were protected, with this custodian was very protective of us. And that happened with other families. In other situations, like in my uncle's situation, his family couldn't take it. The neighbors made their life hell, and they had to come and stay with us. So that was the situation of the families. Many were pauperized. They had to close the business because people weren't paying. People were exploited. And that lasted 3 years until Jewish organizations from abroad interfered through the different European embassy, mostly the Spanish embassy. I won't go over these details. And on June 15, 1970, 3 years and 10 days later, my brother was not freed. He was had to sign paper that he will never set foot in Egypt again. And he was taken from prison all the way to the airport, thrown on an airplane, and he ended up in France. So this was the experience of all Egyptian Jews. And by now, the ethnic cleansing is essentially complete. The youngest is probably in their late 60s or 70s, and there are only a handful now. So that is how the ethnic cleansing of Egyptian Jewry occurred. I tried to compress the whole story into 10 minutes. I'm often asked, some of the question asked, what happened to your brother? So my brother, so my brother had finished 5 years at Cairo University Engineering School. And he finished all his exams, and he was 20 years old before he was arrested, except for one project. And yet they would not give him the degree. My father went and begged the professors, and no professor would consider that. But the Technion in Israel gave him a scholarship, and he got his 3 degrees, bachelor's, master's, and PhD from the Technion. Then he went and worked for the Ministry of Defense, the Israel Armament Development Authority. He did very well. He rebuilt his life. In 1994, he won the Israel Prize. That's the biggest honor in the country for defense, contributions to defense. He was a co-winner that year. And when he retired a few years ago, he got the highest award by the Lifetime Achievement Award. And he now he married a girl he knew when he was a little child, who was thrown out of Egypt in the 1950s. He met her in Paris when he left Egypt, and then now they have 10 grandchildren. So that's, I hope I try to be positive here, but most of us rebuilt our lives, even though the pain is still strong. And we regret very much the fact that our experience, the experience of Jews from Arab countries, is not integrated into the narrative of the Arab-Israeli conflict. We are totally ignored. So that is why I really am grateful for this opportunity, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Rami, thank you very much. I want to just emphasize 2 pieces of this. Number one is the Israel connection, and we'll continue seeing that theme throughout the talks today. But also I want to underscore what you said, that during the earlier times, I guess in the 1930s and earlier, the Egyptian Jewish community had risen to a real leadership role in culture, in the arts, in medicine, in law. And so that we really should see this in that context, that Egypt had a multicultural state at one point, and all of that got lost.
Yes, we contributed more than our share. With all due, in all modesty, we contributed and we served the country more. As I said, Egypt was the most advanced country outside of Europe and Japan. Okay. But unfortunately, you know how we were rewarded.
Right. All right. Thank you, Rami. I want to get the other 2 presentations out on this topic, and then we'll return if there are questions. Janet, I want to turn to you now to share some words from Rose Warsofsky, and to tell us a little bit about Rose's life and background. Rose is a member of our community, by the way. I trust many of you know Joe and Rose. Please.
Thank you. My growing up in Egypt. My name is Rose Warsofsky. I was born in 1943 in a suburb of Cairo called Heliopolis. My maiden name was Rose Polonsky. Both my parents were descendants of Russian Jews. My father was born in Kiev in 1903, and my mother was born in Egypt in 1912. My mother's family came from Leningrad, which is now called St. Petersburg. In 1948, when I was 5 years old, the state of Israel was established, and the migration of Egyptian Jews to Israel started. There I went to an all-day Jewish school called Avraham Bitesh. Most children were Sephardic. Only 10% maybe were Ashkenazic and Karyatis. We were taught French, Hebrew, and Arabic. Until the mid-20th century, Jews, Christians, and Muslims were intricately woven into the fabric of the cosmopolitan society that lived, worked, and shared a country we all called home. And in doing so, they demonstrated acceptance and tolerance. For more than a half a century, stories about the injustices done to Egyptian Jews were concealed from the public. I was 19 years old when we immigrated to the United States. My mother, who was diabetic for over 10 years, fell into a diabetic coma on the way here and was taken to the hospital in Greece, where she died. She was only 51 years old. So I made the rest of my journey with my dad. We settled in Boston as my father had family here. I got married in 1968 and was able to visit my mother's grave every time we traveled to Israel. I also took my husband to Egypt in 2000 to show him where I lived and grew up. I only have good memories of my life there, but a lot of Egyptian Jews were expulsed and their businesses were taken over by the government of Gamal Abdel Nasser. There are only a handful of elderly Jews left in Egypt from a community of over 80,000 in 1948. If anyone has questions, I will gladly answer them. Sincerely, Rose Warsofsky.
Thank you, Janet, and Rose, thank you. The third speaker on this part of our world, Alan. It is wonderful to welcome again a member of our community, Alan Israel, to talk about now his childhood in Egypt. Alan, if you would.
Good afternoon, everybody. I wrote out something that I'd like to read, and hopefully I'll be open for any comments or questions. And I'm talking about, as Rami had said, I'm talking about my personal experience and my family's, but that our experience is shared by many, many Jewish people from the Middle East and Egypt in particular. So I'll talk about my personal experience of being Jewish and growing up in Egypt. I was born in Cairo to loving, bright, educated Jewish parents. My father was an engineer. My mother was a teacher before she was married. She spoke between 4 and 6 languages. Some she could write, some she could only speak. And Rabbi, would you mind if you could show that first slide, which is the certificate? Thank you. So what you see here is my parents' marriage certificate. It is the registration of their marriage with the Grand Rabbinate of Egypt. As Jews, as Rami already pointed out, we are not citizens. Most of us were not citizens. Much of Jewish life was under the auspices of the religious authority. I want you to notice that it's both written in French and Arabic. And this is a photocopy of the marriage certificate of my parents, listing both their names and their parents. If you want, you may, I don't need that anymore unless anybody wants to look at it. Thank you, Rabbi. We spoke French at home and Arabic on the street. We lived in a very large extended family. Marcia, my wife, and I once counted out 44 first cousins. Many of these relatives vacationed together every summer in Alexandria, where 6 to 8 families rented the same houses each year. Mothers and children would spend the summer at the beach. Husbands and fathers worked Monday through Thursday and spent the long weekends with their families. I remember anxiously waiting for the train to come every Thursday evening, and my father coming. As far as school goes, my first 3 years were in a French lycée system. My 4th grade year was spent at St. George's Jesuit School in Egypt, where I began to become familiar with English. It was all French and Arabic till then. The following year, we had left Egypt and I was a student in a public school in Paris. Our housing. We lived in a large apartment in a nice part of Cairo. The apartment was on the 5th floor of a building which had an elevator. It had high ceilings, 2 balconies. We had a refrigerator, not an icebox, and a telephone, which was very uncommon at the time. People had to wait in long lists to be able to get a telephone. As far as food and eating, all the food was fresh. My mother shopped every day. My mother would tell me that if you wanted to cook a chicken for dinner, you'd have to start out early in the morning. It would take all day. First, you'd go find a chicken, then buy the chicken, then have it ritually slaughtered, then have it plucked, and then cook it at home. So, everything was done one thing at a time. As far as, I'm just doing highlights, but some of the Jewish traditions. For example, for Passover, they would buy 10-pound bags of rice, open them up on the table and go through each grain of rice to get rid of the chametz. We didn't just clean the apartment for Passover. They repainted the room where the food was kept for Passover, so everything would be nice and fresh and clean. Some of my favorite childhood memories include weekly trips to the pyramids. We went to go horseback riding. Another place I loved to go was the zoo, which held many wonders for me. I rode an elephant, fed the giraffe, watched lions and tigers eat. If you can imagine, a zoo in Cairo was pretty well stocked. Africa was just down a little bit south of there. So my father graduated university as an engineer, but had to begin work as a draftsman because he was Jewish, not from Cairo, and had few connections. The Muslim engineers were hired by the government. The Christian engineers were hired by friends or family in an old boys network. But my father's family didn't have connections in Cairo. He was from Luxor. He started out as a draftsman first, and a few years later became managing engineer and partner for the Egyptian Supply Company. His company did work on major projects such as the Voice of America radio station, as well as the Pepsi-Cola bottling plant in Egypt. In 1958, we received a notice from the government saying that we had to leave the country within a week. We knew many people who had been expelled from the country, but now it was us. This is a little, and Rami probably would know this, but this is, a little bit how Egypt worked. Yeah. My father went to see a Muslim friend of his who was very high up in the government. And this man was able to pull our family's deportation file and have it destroyed. We were now on our own. My parents had been making plans for leaving for several years. A few months after we got that letter, my father's company was taken over by the Egyptian government. They called that nationalization. And Rami, I think you touched on that as well. At the time, all that time, we had been trying to leave, but being Jewish, we were not citizens, so we had no passports. Finally, HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, helped us migrate to France, where we met up with my uncle's family at an immigrant hotel in Paris. We lived there for almost a year, waiting for a visa to come to the United States. And Rabbi, if you would you mind showing that other piece of paper, that other document? Thank you. If you can take a look at that, this is my father's accounting of their assets when we arrived in this country. All the money is in dollars, francs, pounds, and it all added up to $812.37 for a family of 5 and my grandmother to start a life over. So I just wanted to end here. There are millions of other stories we can tell, but I thought I would, I thought that would be a good amount of feel, to give you a good idea about how things were. And so if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take a shot at them.
Thank you, Alan. I think what we're going to do is complete the presentations and then we'll open things up for some questions. But Alan, I just want to underscore that you as well have shown that sense of having been solidly middle class and accomplished and comfortable, and the incredible vulnerability of the community at the same time.
That's, I think, what Rami expressed very well, and I'm so glad you picked up on that, because that's really what it was. I mean, you could be doing very well, but you had that fatal flaw.
I just something I didn't emphasize is that nearly all of us left Egypt pauperized. $872. I am
no, 812.
812. Ours was we could only take 5 Egyptian pounds each. But a friend, Muslim friends who worked for the Ministry of Commerce made that 15 pounds, which turned out to be between about less than $50. That's what we left with.
We were supposed to leave with $50 for each adult and $25 for each child. But just a little bit before we left, my father, who had been working with European companies, had one of his payments go to a bank in Europe, and that made up the bulk of the $400 in US dollars that we were able to bring with us. So that's, you're right, that's how it was. That's including what we were able to smuggle out of there.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, well, our story is going to shift now and speak to 2 people. I want to first introduce Danielle Murad Weiss, who Danielle is a graduate student at Columbia University, finishing a second master's degree there. Her work is in international and public affairs. And before being at Columbia, Danielle was a student of Laurie's at Northeastern, where they first met each other. I want to say just a short word about Danielle's work, because it is fascinating and we really should arrange an opportunity to bring Danielle back at some point. She has studied and worked in international government, including the NATO Defense College in Rome, the United Nations headquarters in New York, and Israel's International Institute for Counterterrorism, where Danielle has researched public resilience as a means of countering the effect produced by terror. And again, that idea of how are people resilient is one of the major issues that people are working on today in so many different domains, not only in terms of resilience in the face of terror, but Danielle has also done research on disaster recovery in Japan, where some of you know there have been major disasters, both nuclear and tsunami related in recent years. Danielle is someone who is a dual national, both of Canada and Mexico, the two sides of the United States, as we refer to it. And Danielle is going to speak about her upbringing in Mexico City and the Mexico City Jewish community. So Danielle, I turn things over to you.
Well, thank you so much. It's really, really exciting to be here and to talk to you. And I do want to say to Rami and Alan, thank you for sharing those stories. They're very similar to what my family, the Canadian side that actually comes from Iraq, went through as well. So it hits close to home, and it's always maybe not happy stories, but great to hear of that as well. But I'm excited to talk a little bit about the Mexican community. It's a community that's often referred to as small, but that makes noise. We're about 0.04% of the population in Mexico. There's about 60,000 Jews, according to the last census that was in 2020. And so it's fairly small in a population of over 124 million people, yet we've managed to build something that's fairly stable, fairly large. So maybe I'll talk a little about the history and how it came about. So funnily enough, there's been Jews in Mexico since the 1519. So they actually came over with the Spaniards. So Hernan Cortés comes and there's a group of Jews that come along with him. But the establishment of the community doesn't come until the 1920s, when you see formal groups of immigrants coming. When they come, they start working in small businesses as vendors or whatever they can get there, they can do. I mean, they don't know the language, they don't know the system. So they're trying to get their feet together. And so as the Jews start settling there, they start helping others. They provide shelter, jobs, food for the new immigrants that are coming in. Something that's particularly unique about the Jewish community in Mexico today, and I don't know if this is something that happens anywhere else, is that it is fairly divided into four main communities. So unlike in the US that it's mostly just Ashkenazi or Sephardic, you have Ashkenazi, so Central European, Sephardic, so Greece, Turkey, and the Balkans. You have the Magen David community, which is the Syrians that came from Aleppo. And then you have the Monte Sinai community, that are the Syrians that came from Damascus, as well as the Lebanese community. And each of them will chart their history and their course and their institutions pretty much parallelly, but independently, although there is certain opportunities for everybody to come together and interact. I will say there's a fifth group that is developed that's called the Bet Israel community. And this is a more conservative group, and it's mostly funded by US Jews that come to Mexico and take on a more conservative approach as opposed to the more orthodox running of the other four. And so already in 1917, you have the first Jewish school. It's from the Monte Sinai community, so Syrian. And even then is the first time that the president allows for the establishment of a house of faith. And so since then, everything begins to develop forwards. Various synagogues are created. In 1924, you have the first integral school. So not only a Jewish school for Jewish thought, but also teaching every subject out there. That's the Israeli School of Mexico. And that is a school that also eventually continues to evolve up to today and has gone through different evolutions. There is also the development of, for example, all ranges of organizations and institutions to fill the needs of the people, from a retirement home called the Ashel that continues to operate today, to charity organizations that work on a whole range of things, from Foyam Farin, which is an organization that was providing wedding dresses and the necessary things for young couples to establish their life right after marriage. to the building of cemeteries and so on. And one of those important institutions is the Jewish Sports Center that's established in 1950. It is a massive institution, and I think I have a couple of pictures of that I can share. 1 second. And so this is a newspaper right at the creation. And so you can see there's all kinds of sports, from softball, basketball, football. There's a Olympic-sized swimming pool, all kinds of things. And it's basically the sports center where I have gone to, and we've all been raised. And if you see the picture in color on the right, that's basically what it looks like today. You can see the diving board that we continue to have in this sort of a thing that we've all enjoyed and talked about growing up and going to this community center. But I cannot emphasize the size of it. It has an Olympic-sized swimming pool. It has tennis, basketball, football courts. They do dance, Israeli folk dance classes. They have art classes and everything. So there's so many kids from the Jewish community that in their afternoons end up going to the sports center and engaging all sorts of activities and meeting people and engaging. So I do want to talk a little bit about the Ashkenazi community, because it's very, very important to me. Although my dad's side of the family is Iraqi, my mom's side, they were coming from Russia and Poland. But why it's so important to me is that my grandfather eventually served as the first president of the Ashkenazi community in Mexico. And up until today, he has devoted so much of his work to the building of this institution and everything that surrounds it. So again, from these different ad hoc organizations that had been developed since the 1920s, they eventually come together and decide we want to have a different approach, an organization that addresses all of the needs and issues that the Ashkenazi community is going to have. And so they create this council. And here I have a picture of my grandfather in the council, which is, I'm very proud. I'm a very proud granddaughter, and I know we're all pretty excited. So the man in the middle with the very, very colorful tie, that's my grandfather. And I guess one of the greatest stories from his time in the council is, the development of one of the first synagogues within the Ashkenazi community, which is called Ramat Shalom. And for me, it's even more special because my mom and my dad were the first wedding that took place in the synagogue. And the fun story is that when the wedding was supposed to take place, the synagogue wasn't actually fully constructed yet. And there actually wasn't a ceiling, but it was very important for my mom and for my grandfather to have that to signal it. So the days leading up to their wedding, there was so much rain. And so they were joking, you're gonna have to row down the aisle because it's gonna be flooded. But miraculously that night, everything cleared. And they were able to basically put everything together. They had the wedding, and then the decorations for their wedding were actually used a couple weeks later for the high holidays, and was the first time that the high holidays were celebrated in this synagogue in Mexico. So beyond that, I'll talk a little bit about modern life. And so what we've been to in Mexico, there's a lot of different schools. So you have schools that are particular to the communities, as well as intercommunitarian schools where you have students from a range of them coming together. You also have yeshivas, different degrees of religiosity and different focus, but it is fairly spread out that way. I went to a school called Colegio Hebreo Tarbut, and this was an intercultural school. I went only for high school. I actually was in an American school before that. This was my parents really hoped that I could really develop my English. My dad's Canadian, so that was also a very important part as well. But within these schools, not only do we have all of the regular subjects, we also study English, but we also had a number of classes in Hebrew, in Israeli culture, Israeli history, and Bible studies as well. And it was very much part of everything we do. A story I like to tell is when I started school, all of my peers that had been in school since kindergarten and learning Hebrew since kindergarten, I was definitely not at their level. So they would send me to a special room and I would study. And for the first year I did that. But after, they're like, you have to go back to class. So in order to do my Israeli history exams that had to be mandatorily written in Hebrew, I would take a Spanish to Hebrew translation and read word by word. And that's how I would write my exams. But it helped. I mean, now I can fight with Israeli bus drivers. So it's good. It worked out. Beyond that, there's a number of different cultural groups and social groups for people in the community to be. So we have Tnuot, so these young Jewish organizations from Maccabi Hatzair that meet every week, to the Scouts. It's a Jewish chapter of the Boys and Girl Scouts of whatever it is, but they meet every week. You have Nor Hatzair and all of these, and you really see a huge number of kids every weekend going and getting together, and they do camps and all kinds of things over the summer. And here I can also share a picture of what our school looks like. And this was our graduation. I don't know why I can't find it right now, but if not, I'll share it now. But beyond that, we have a number of organizations that also look out for the community itself. So we have a group called Cadena, and what they do is, I think I'm sharing, right? This is our graduation. But beyond that, we have these groups that do all kinds of different events. So we have this group I mentioned, Cadena. They're there to specialize on disaster recovery. And so when we've had earthquakes in Mexico or natural disasters, they'll be there and helping rescue people. My cousins are very much involved. So we recently had an earthquake where a lot of buildings in the city collapsed, and they were in there looking for people, helping rescue them, all that. More so, they actually ended up going and helping after the collapse of the Surfside condominium in Miami, and they were there lending a hand as well. Other groups are Atsala. We have a chapter of Atsala. And something that is precise, perhaps unique, is a group called Bitachon, which means security. So essentially, the Jewish community is very much focused on taking care of itself and making sure that it's safe. So these are students that volunteer to basically, they go through training, and during every Shabbat, every Jewish holiday, every event, they'll actually stand outside and make sure that nothing weird is happening or that nobody's coming, to make sure that the community is safe. The same applies for all of us in Jewish schools. During our last year of high school, we would have to come into school one day early to just make sure that everything in school was okay, from the structural integrity of the building in case there was an earthquake, to making sure that nobody was in there or that there wasn't any drawings or weapons or anything of the sort, and make sure that all of our peers were safe when they came in. So again, not because we're actively threatened, but it's a proactive way in which to keep ourselves safe as a minority in a country. And so finally, just a little bit about the culture, and it's very close to me because it's something I've done my whole life. There are a whole range of things that happen within Mexico celebrating dance and music and theater. And so first off, we have what's called the Festival Aviv, so the Aviv Festival. It's a giant Israeli folk dance festival and competition. And so this is something I did throughout high school. All of the Jewish schools will create their own dances, and they'll come together and compete. This is my last time competing with my school, and they're all different dances, often focused on different Jewish communities from different parts of the world. There was also, we have what's called Anachnu Ve'atem, which is a Jewish dance company, and we tour not only Mexico, but different parts of the world, bringing, light to our culture and everything. And so these are some of the tours we went on. The picture with all of us in the blue and the triangle is actually when we performed in one of the most important theaters in Mexico, which was a really, really amazing experience. And then again, we have all kinds of other programs. So the Abima Theater Festival, where different groups of students perform different things. We have an international Jewish film festival, as well as a Blowy Shine, where different bands compete. And I guess this is a lot just in general, but maybe to finish it up, one really neat thing is how we've been able to meld the culture from Mexico and from the Latin flair we have with our Jewish values. And so one of the really cool things that has come up is how we've mixed cuisine that's very traditional with what is Mexican. And so a few of our very well-known dishes, so gefilte fish, we all know, but now we have it, what would be called a la veracruzana, which is in tomato sauce with chili and hot sauce peppers on it, as well as kippe, which you'll have, but not with guacamole and salsa as well. So these are just a little bit of the things that make the Jewish community what it is today, but happy to go more in depth into any specifics later on in the Q&A. But thank you for letting me share, and yeah.
Thank you, Danielle. I was very struck in the dance photos at the way the dance costumes combined the Mexican and Israeli both together in the clothing. It really captures that, as of course the gefilte fish did. And also I want to underscore the emphasis on sports facilities, the deportivos, this sense that what we would call a JCC is at the center of community connection, but also, as you heard, all of the Israel organizations, the way Maccabi and Hatzalah and all of these terms that we know from Israel are replicated in some of these diverse Jewish communities around the world. Hebrew language is often the shared language that Jews have when they visit other countries. And it's much stronger. I've seen this elsewhere in Europe as well as in Latin America than within America, that sense that Israeli culture and Jewish culture work together in that way. But Danielle, I wanted to ask just one question, since the conversation about Egypt so focused on government relations. Is there any issue, anything to mention about relations with the government, about Israel, and government policy, and the Jews as a minority group in Mexico?
Absolutely. I mean, so within all of these institutions that were developed, there is something called the Central Committee, and it's the committee in charge of everything for all of the different communities together. And they're mostly the ones that are going to be doing any type of relationship with the government and things of the sorts. In general, the Jewish community lives very well. You have a lot of Jews that are in government as well, and doing different things in certain positions. I mean, the political situation is not because of the Jewish community per se, but just because of what's going on in Mexico. It's getting trickier and trickier. But we, as a community, we're strong, we're well, there's good ties and there's good relationships between both. But what is definitely very true is that it is a community that's extremely tied to Israel. One thing I forgot to say, for example, is in grade 9, all students will travel for a month in the summer to Israel and all of this. And so there is a sense that, we're comfortable and we're grateful to be in Mexico, in the place that we've been able to develop and thrive. But there is always a sense that, Israel is there for a reason, and the connection is very strong in that way.
Thank you. Thank you. So our final speaker this afternoon is Yona Weisslieder. And Yona, it is so wonderful to see you. Our connection to Yona goes back. It's through our daughter, Samara. And Yona, I wanted to just say a little bit about your work. Yona's family comes from, in its origins, from that part of Eastern Europe that we've talked about, family from Poland, Belarus, and from Russia. And Yona was raised, and the place to which she goes back is Costa Rica. Yona, in her work over the years, has been very involved in Jewish community life. She represented her school in the International Tanakh Bible competition back in 2005. She was active in Hanoar Hatzioni youth movement, the young Zionist movement. She participated in several machanot camps in Mexico, Peru, Ecuador, and Argentina, and also did a course with the IDF, with the Israeli Defense Forces, during some of her time there. That's just a little bit of it, but it gives you a sense of the depth and variety of Israel connectedness in Yona's life and in her community. She lives now in New York City with her husband, Adam, and an 8-month-old daughter, Talia. And Yona, we are delighted to welcome you now to speak a little bit about the Jewish community in Costa Rica.
Thank you so much. I think a lot of my history really replicates what Danielle said, but in a much smaller scale. It was kind of funny to hear that Mexico is a small community, which is, for us in Costa Rica, we'll look it up as one of the big communities in Latin America. So I'm gonna share just a few slides I put together, which are going to help me just kind of ground everyone into what Costa Rica is and what the community there does. So let me just share my screen. Okay. So first off, where is Costa Rica? Many of you have heard of it as like a nice place to go for vacation, especially for ecotourism, but I can also understand if you don't know where it is. It's a really small country in Central America. To the north, we have Nicaragua, and to the south, we have Panama, which is another one of the big and thriving Jewish communities in Latin America. So our population is pretty small. As you can see, we passed the 5 million population about 2 years ago. And even in terms of area, it's less than 20,000 square miles. Our capital is San Jose, and that's really where most of the Jews live. In the past, we had a different capital called Cartago, and that's where like the first settlement of Jews happened, and they moved to San Jose. So if you're wondering how Jews came to this country in kind of the middle of nowhere, that was never the goal. A lot of the Jews from Eastern European, mostly Poland, they really wanted to come to America, and wherever the ship landed, they stayed. The story of the community in Costa Rica really starts with about 7 people. They came in a ship. They landed in Costa Rica right around the time before the Holocaust. They started working, then they started bringing their family. And then there was like a second wave that came, kind of survivors of the Holocaust. They came by plane, and it was a lot about just rekindling with family. We also had kind of a first wave that came with Christopher Columbus, similar to what Danielle was saying in Mexico. Most of them were Jews that were trying to escape the Inquisition, and they just kind of blended. And there was also, before the turn of the century, another immigration of Sephardic Jews that came to Costa Rica. They really didn't founded a community, and then they just assimilated. So the main community in Costa Rica, it's called Centro Israelita Sionista de Costa Rica. So very important that in the name we call Zionist. It's something that we feel very proud and really highlights our connection to Israel. The founding year was 1934. Those kind of first pioneers came around 1932. The current location is San Jose. As I said before, it was in Cartago. And our kind of the size of our community is around 1,700 Jews. So much smaller than what Danielle was mentioning from Mexico. There in total in the Costa Rican country, there might be around 2,500 Jews. That would include the the Reform community that's also in San Jose, and then 2 other kind of mostly Israeli communities that are in 2 beach towns. Sometimes they come and they participate in the main community, but mostly they're a separate thing. When we talk about the community in Costa Rica, El Centro Israelita, it really is what has all the main institutions. And one thing that my mom always likes to joke about is that we're a small community, but we're still big enough to at least have one of each. So we have our synagogue, which we can see here in the picture. This is the main entrance. We have a Hebrew day school, which I attended from preschool up to high school, same as my parents and siblings. And actually, my grandpa was one of the people that helped found the school. We have a cemetery, which was one of the first things that got founded, especially as people came to Costa Rica and they just needed to bury their loved ones. And that's kind of when they started to think about, okay, we're actually staying in Costa Rica. We also have a country club and some of the worldwide organizations like WITSO, Bnei Brit, Keren Hayesod, Keren Kayemet. We also have Kalena, which Danielle was referring, and actually my mom was one of the first presidents of the institution in Costa Rica. So we have quite a lot. If you want to kind of have a very Jewish life in Costa Rica, it's very possible. Another very important thing is that it's mostly Ashkenazi Jews coming from Eastern European, and it's an Orthodox community. When we say Orthodox, we really mean the synagogue is Orthodox. The school, we have daily prayers twice a day. Everything's kosher. If you go to a wedding, a bar mitzvah, everything's gonna be kosher. The country club's food is also kosher. So it kind of gives you something to aspire to. And if you want to be a bit more religious, you can be, but the majority are really traditionalists. And this means that everyone really celebrates the high holidays. Everyone knows what's Passover. Everyone knows what Purim is. We study, similar to what Danielle was saying, like Hebrew, Israeli culture, Israeli politics, Jewish history, Tanakh, pretty much everything in school. So you know, and then you decide kind of what you wanna strive for. But when it comes to the synagogue, we sit separately. Only the man would read the Torah, and kind of more of the traditional way of just conducting Jewish religious life. And here we can see just some pictures. A lot of them feature me and my family. So actually, the picture on the left, that's from my wedding. So as you can see, it's a very traditional Jewish wedding with the talit on top of the chuppah, men and women sitting separately. And we have quite a few activities in our community, from like a challah bake, where it's really just about like finding moments to connect with women and having the mitzvah of creating baking challah for Shabbat. Here we also have some images of the time we inaugurated the new community center and the synagogue. So the picture on the top right, that's my grandpa and my older brother holding Torahs as they introduced them from the previous synagogue to the new one. And then a more current picture, that's my mom and a few other women in an activity for Sukkot. So we really have a thriving community. I feel like up until I went to college, most of my friends and pretty much everyone I knew was Jewish. And for a lot of people, that's really when you enter the real world. You might have a few friends from your extracurriculars, but really Monday to Friday, you go to school. Then Friday night, you might go to shul. And then Saturday, you either go to the country club, which, as I said, it's like something that might not be the most religious thing of going to the country club on a Saturday. But there's also some people, like the most religious people, would go on Sunday. And then Saturday afternoons, the teenagers would go to the youth movement, which I was very much involved in my youth years. And then as I graduated college, I was also involved with Beit Scopus, which is another institution mostly geared towards young professionals to keep them grounded into holidays and just have a moment to meet and enjoy some time with other Jews. Then, as Danielle was saying, we also have Bitachon. I was part of it, as well as my siblings. And it's a very important institution. I know here in the US, it's kind of a new thing to think about, like, oh, I'm going to have someone standing outside asking who's this person entering. But when you live in a country where you're a minority, when there might be some other political situations happening, it's always very important to kind of take care of yourself. And you never know when something might happen. And unfortunately, we've had some terrible situations happen in other countries like Argentina, where part of my family is. And actually, one of my mom's cousins died in the explosion that occurred in La Amia. So really growing up in Costa Rica, you get to meet a lot of different Jews from different parts of the world. So we had most of the people come from Poland, as I said, and then after the war, we got some people from Austria, from just different Eastern European countries as well. But later in the 1980s and up until like the 2000s, when there was economical crises or political crises in a lot of South American countries, they would emigrate to Costa Rica. So from my mom's side, my grandparents are actually Argentinian, both descendant from Polish and Russian Jews. And when things were not there, things were not very good there. There was the dictatorship. My grandpa's brother was already in Costa Rica, and they decided to move to Costa Rica. One of the first people they met were my dad's parents. So when my parents got married, it was kind of funny that it's like my grandparents were friends their entire lives, and then all of a sudden their kids were getting married, and they were always very close throughout their lives. So we received a lot of different Jews, and actually we do have some Sephardic Jews that came through this later immigration. So we've had people marry people from Panama, and then they moved to Costa Rica. We had people from Mexico, Peru, Venezuela. So you get to see a wide range of people just meeting each other and getting married. Actually, my husband, he was born in Israel, but he's Colombian. We met in New York City, but it's a very typical story when it comes to Costa Rica. The other thing I would mention when it comes to kind of government relationships and just activity outside of the community, we do have quite a few people from the community that have been involved in the public life. We've had vice presidents, we've had Congress people. In the past election this February, one of the candidates was Jewish, and he ended up in 4th place and was elected to Congress. So it is something that people are involved. There is the risk of anti-Semitism, but it's not as bad as a lot of different countries. And altogether, Costa Rica is a very safe place. We don't have an army. We abolished the army in 1949. So that also gives people a sense of security. And a lot of these migrations that I mentioned is people kind of escaping harsher governments, or just different political situations. They found Costa Rica to be some sort of safe haven. So I'm going to leave it here. And if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yonah, thank you. That wedding picture is stunning, by the way. Excuse me. I just want to highlight, Yonah, in what you said, that a small Jewish community can be an intense Jewish community. It does not necessarily mean that there are less institutions. It simply means that the community comes together. And one of the topics that we might talk about at another time is the way in which, in a small Jewish community like the community you come from, the different religious denominations, people need to work together. And there's, I'm sure that there are intercommunal issues, but there's also a strong sense of working together and of mutual tolerance within the community. And as you pointed out in those photographs, some beautiful, beautiful institutions. I also just want to highlight what you said, which is a really interesting observation, that the army was abolished and people felt more secure. And that is really an interesting observation, but we will let that stand for right now. Lori, you raised your hand. I'll give you the opportunity for the first question.
Thank you, Lenny. Oh, these presentations were so wonderful. And the contrast between the generation that whose families were forced to leave Egypt, and the young people who emerge out of still thriving Jewish communities in Latin America is quite striking to me. At first, I want to just say how moved I am to see my own beloved young people here. Danielle, who studied at Northeastern and choreographed, was a winner of our Gideon Klein Award and choreographed a fabulous dance in memory of the Holocaust. And Yonah, who was really a bat bayit, lived with us on and off when she was a roommate to our daughter. And I just, it's just gorgeous to see both of you and hear your similar stories. One of the things that I was struck with when you lived with us, when you were around in our lives, Yonah, is that it felt like all of these small Jewish Spanish-speaking Jewish communities of young people would meet each other when they did some kind of program in Israel together. And then you'd find yourselves in Boston, and all these Jewish young people from Spanish-speaking countries were friends with each other because of the Israel connection. And in some ways, here you are, here's my question. Both of you, Danielle and Yona, are in New York City, where there is so much opportunity for Jewish life, and where there's egalitarian Judaism, which is so important to me, which you don't have in your home countries. And yet your generation is much less likely to be involved in Jewish life, or to send their children to expensive Jewish day schools, or to belong to JCCs. Here in America, where the population is so much bigger, and we have so many more institutions. So I find that paradoxical. And I wonder, as you, Yona, you have a young family, Danielle, you were engaged with security issues, Israel issues, how you reflect on your own futures, if in the United States, by contrast with the kind of Jewish life you had growing up.
Yeah, and I could take that first. So that is a big thing. And one of the main things that we as like a young family think about is definitely we would love to send our daughter to Jewish day school. It's just something we grew up with. The main difference is that when you grew up in Latin America, going to private school, whether it's like private Jewish school or private American school, it is a luxury, but it's not as much as a luxury as it would be here in the US. Also, if you go to public school, it's not like a public school here in the US or Boston, where you still get the Jewish holidays off because half of the population is Jewish. It's really a minority. It's really geared towards more lower income people. So there is kind of like that big contrast, but that is something that me and my husband, we would love to send our daughter to Jewish day school and have her also learn Hebrew like we know, and like all the holidays, and have that as part of her growing up. Also, when I first arrived in New York, and my husband that has been here longer, he used to be a member of the Jewish Latin Center, which really was a Chabad center focused on Jews from Latin America, really understanding what that means, being more on the traditionalist side, giving that opportunity to reconnect with people that you met in Israel or camps elsewhere. I always joke that whereas in the US you would go away camp is in a different state and you have friends from different states, when you're in a small community of less than 2,000 people, go away camp means go to a different country, and then you meet people from different countries. Actually, before meeting my husband, I had met his sister at camp. So it's just kind of like those connections that happen, and that we definitely would love our daughter to share.
Danielle, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. I thought that was amazing, and a lot of it really, really resonates with me as well. I think two things for me that have been really important. So I think as I've grown up and I've moved around, I've moved pretty much every 6 months for a few 3-year periods. And so you have to learn what you need in your life to be complete. When you're basically uprooted, you have to start from zero. You don't know anyone. And for me, what I found is that one of those things is dance. As you can tell, it's something I've done and continue to do. But another really important thing for me is that community. And so whether it's been in Rome, in Japan, in New York, in Boston, wherever I've been, I've sought out that Jewish community. And for me, it's been mostly through Chabad, because I found that, there's Chabad in Tokyo, which is insane to me. But anywhere you go, you're able to go. And it's not necessarily always that you're going to be meeting the local people, but you're suddenly in there and you're in a Shabbat dinner and you're saying the same prayers and you're singing the same melodies as you do at home. And suddenly, even if you're all alone and in a new country, you don't know anyone, you're still at home. And I think that's something that has been very important to me and has sort of solidified my Jewish identity as I've gone on. And the second part is that I think growing up in these communities that are a minority in a bigger country, but are yet so closed off, I think there's some things like our chip, or how we're hardwired in our perception of our Judaism, our connection to Israel is different. And so it's been a lot of dialogue and maybe not struggle, but of understanding, what it is like to grow up as a Jew in the US, where in many ways, it's kind of like a more common thing, especially if you're talking about the US or Boston or all these places where, you know, everybody is kind of okay with it, to growing up in a place where maybe it's not so open. It's like okay within your community, but not so much outside of it. And I think it's been useful in understanding how Judaism is a part of your identity and how it connects to how you do everything and how you perceive the world and your connection to Israel and your connection or your philosophy of life. And I don't know if I just went down on a tangent, but I think it's just this construct, this going back and forth has really helped do that for me and identify that it is something that's extremely important in driving my life and something that I hope to transfer one day to my kids as well.
We are going to continue. Thank you, Danielle. We're going to continue for 10 more minutes till about 2:30. Does anyone have any questions for Alan or Rami? Yes, it says Debbie there. But go ahead.
Under a new identity.
Yes.
Robert. I question for Alan and for Rami. I understand at the time that there was no identity in Egypt for the Jews and no respect, and I wonder how the Jews were received in the places you went to at that time. I'm not calling you old, but it was a long time ago. And I wonder how the Jews were received in like Paris and then in America. And it's kind of a two-part question also, like what the process it was then to make it to America. So I wonder if, you know, I guess that's kind of what I wonder, where you left a place where it was very difficult for the Jews to exist to how they were received at the time in like Paris and then America.
Rami, if you
Alan,
would.
do you want to answer or do you want me to answer?
Rami, why don't you start?
Okay, so the way we left Egypt is through the support of Jewish organizations like EAS, and then when we were in France, we were received and taken care of by another organization called the Kojazor. If I translate this is an abbreviation, so it's the Jewish Committee for Social Action and Reconstruction. We were housed in a hotel, and from there, Jews would choose where they would like to go. My brother went to Israel. He was received with open arms. He got a scholarship at the Technion. He went through he got help with housing. He got all his 3 degrees at the Technion. So he definitely, Israel received him with open arm, and he was he thrived there. As I said earlier, he had 10 grandchildren. Now, as for us, my father was old and didn't think he could find a job in Israel. He was 64. And when, so he has took us to the United States. We had contacts with, they give us a few addresses, American Jews, and we were received with open arm. We came pauperized. My mother, who was a principal of 2 Jewish schools in Cairo, she ran to the last Jewish school, which closed in 1966, but she didn't know English. They put her through training, and she went and worked. We got a lot of help from the Jewish Family and Children's Service, and from the Jewish community, we got a lot of support. I joined a synagogue called Kehillat Israel, I alone. Young, they took me, and I made a lot of friends right away. So there was, we were able to come back on our feet. It took a long time. When I was in college, I had a scholarship, but I had to work in order to help my parents with the rent. So it was a struggle, financial struggle, nevertheless. And for a long time, I had to help. I was in high school and I had to work in the summer. And in college, even though I had a generous scholarship, I had to work to help my parents with the rent and so on. So we were taken care of. It was a struggle. It was stressful. And then, but we were able to stand on our feet again. I was able to send all my children to Jewish school from kindergarten to 12th grade. And that was a very good experience.
Wonderful.
Thank you. And an important reminder about the role of Jewish Families and Children's Services and the role of HIAS and of the Joint to this day in helping refugee communities, including right now the Ukrainian community.
Thank you, Rabbi. I forgot to mention the AJGC, the American Joint Distribution Committee. They also helped us. So that's. By the way, my synagogue in Egypt, 90% went to Israel, but among the 10% who were in France, Switzerland, and the US, Brazil, Australia, one of them settled in San Francisco, and they founded their own synagogue with their own rituals and rites.
Wow.
So, and they got help from the Bay State Jewish community. And we have a synagogue now in Daly City, and we do hold service by Zoom since COVID, and we're planning to continue that. So no, both the US and Israel were a blessing. Thank you.
Thank you. Alan, I'll give you the last word, please.
Make it short.
Oh, boy.
We were sponsored to come to the United States by relatives of ours who were kicked out, or actually left on their own in 1956. So when we landed in France, you know, it was a big change in scenery, but as we've said, some Jewish organizations really supported us, kept us alive and safe, and until, you know, as Rami said, we were able to get back on our feet. My parents sent all three of us, their children, to college. You know, my father again started at a very lower position when he came to the United States, because people did not recognize his degree from Cairo University. If it was pyramids we wanted to build, they would have hired him right away. But he started out again as a draftsman or something like that before he became the head engineer at several places. So we joined it. I had just started Hebrew school before we left Egypt. When we came to the United States, we joined a temple, you know, pretty much immediately, because that was part of our social and cultural life. And we joined temples where we met people, where, you know, my parents made friends, we made friends, and on the whole, very supportive. And it is really important, and I'm sure that the Jewish communities and Jewish organizations get support from the Jewish community.
It's nice to hear that it was based on the support of the Jewish groups, and then also the hard work and faith in the family. So that's nice to hear.
Yeah, no, we are very grateful, really, for everything that we are able to have and share with people, because that's, you know, that became our family again and our life again. I mean, we made life happen in just to say a couple different continents. So things were different, the backgrounds were different, but I have to say, you know, my parents, my mother and father, they basically gave us security for us to be able to grow up and be what we wanted to be, which is why we came to the United States. My parents would have preferred to live in Europe if it was just for themselves, but they thought it would be a much better future in the United States for their kids. So there's me, my sister and brother, and they made the choice to come here rather than live in Europe. And you know, the sky is the limit, but you also have to watch yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to draw people's attention to a note that Yona put in the chat. about kosher food, that in small communities, for example, Costa Rica lost its shochet. So once a month, someone comes from Panama to slaughter the animals that are needed for the food in the community. I know that a friend of mine in Israel is a Mohel, and he travels all over Asia doing circumcisions for small Jewish communities in Hong Kong and Japan and elsewhere. So if you can imagine such a thing, you know, we sometimes need to get somebody to come down from Brookline. They might need to get somebody to take a 10-hour flight. I wanted to end with an excerpt from a poem, and I'm going to put the name of the poem and the author in the chat. Marge Piercy wrote a poem called Magid, which Lori and I have included in many of our Passover Seders. It's a poem that describes what it means to leave your home. And we've heard so many stories of multiple transitions. And often we think of it, and even the way we just described it, we went to a new country, we were warmly welcomed, we were pauperized, but we found support. But Marge Piercy reminds us that leaving one culture and leaving one language and leaving familiar places is a tremendous big deal, and it is heroic. And for those people who in their family stories have multiple generations of such leavings and arrivals, the Passover Seder is an important time to retell those stories. So I want to first of all thank the Adult Ed Committee. Janet, thank you for your leadership in putting together this program. But I do want to end with a few lines from Marge Piercy, and then we'll conclude for today. Magid, the courage to let go of the door, the handle, the courage to shed the familiar walls whose very stains and leaks are comfortable, the courage to abandon the graves dug into the hill, the small bones of children and the brittle bones of the old, the courage to leave the place whose language you learned as early as your own, whose customs, however dangerous or demeaning, bind you like a halter, the courage to walk out of the pain that is known into a pain that cannot be imagined, mapless, walking into the wilderness, going barefoot with a canteen into the desert. My friends, those are the stories that we've heard, stories of courage and bravery, stories of transition, and stories of a world Jewish community that tries and sometimes succeeds to support one another in all of the places of our diaspora. Again, to Rami, to Alan, to Rose, to Yona and Danielle, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. And what a set of insights we're leaving today with. Thank you all.
For the opportunity. Thank you.
Absolutely. Good to meet you, Rami.
Bye.
Thank you, Rami. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you,
Thank you.
Yoda. And thank you, Rose and Alan.
Thank you
Thanks, everybody.
for the opportunity.
Bye, everybody.
And again, we will have a recording available for people who want to hear the program or you want to share this with. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye, all.
Thank you all for a wonderful
Thank you.
presentation. So much appreciated.